Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. My guest today is former Navy SEAL and Special Operations Team Leader Jack Carr, who led boots on the ground operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the southern Philippines. He's also a best-selling author, and his most recent book is called Targeted Beirut, which covers the 1983 Beirut bombing on Marine barracks in Lebanon. Now, this was a horrific event, over 241 American servicemen killed, and this was the single largest one-day loss of life in the Marine Corps since World War II. Now, the reason I wanted to talk to Jack today was because given the recent events in Lebanon, the 1983 Beirut bombing is largely agreed to have been the event that launched Hezbollah's political influence and regional power. So today we dive into that 1983 event and the timeline from then until today and try to understand as best that we can all of the players involved in today's conflicts. Now, Jack, as somebody who spent boots on the ground time in combat, is the first to say some of these wars we're fighting today are flat out not necessary. I found him to be very honest and very pragmatic and very real. Here is Jack Carr. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Jack Carr. Jack, it's great to have you on the show, man. I'm looking forward to chatting with you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I like that microphone too. I haven't seen one that usually they're silver, those kinds, but I like the blue.
Oh, yeah. Yeti blue. Yeah. It does the trick, man. Look, there's like a handful of directions I want to go with you today. So we're going to move relatively quickly through a handful of different subjects, but I want to talk about, so you're releasing a book right now called Targeted Beirut. And we're going to get into this, but the reason I wanted to chat with you was because I feel like, as I understand the concepts of this book right now, it's probably more relevant today than ever, because when we try to understand the plethora of global conflicts that are erupting around the world, it's really easy to be like, oh, these are isolated territorial disputes over here, or ongoing cultural tensions that always bubble up over here. But when you really dive into them, if you want to understand the foundations of a lot of these conflicts, you can trace their roots back to some events that occurred in the 80s, where there's some really concrete events that occurred and groups that were formed as a consequence of the war in Lebanon. And so I want to get into that with you today. And first of all, do you think that assumption holds any weight? Like, am I correct to kind of pull on that thread and say, we can trace the foundation of a lot of the conflicts today back to Lebanon in the 80s? What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah. And you can go back even further if you're looking at that part of the world specifically, to even the coup in 1953 in Iran that was CIA sponsored, that still weighs heavily on Iranian foreign policy and domestic politics today, probably domestic politics even more so. So there were terrorist events in this case in particular before Beirut 1983. But the reason I wanted to start this series with Beirut 1983 is because it really set the framework for everything that was to come, both on the Iranian side and on the U.S. side, meaning there were terrorist events before, but this was what they call the spectacular attack. And I don't like using that word, but that's the one that's used in circles to discuss different terrorist events, meaning a spectacular terrorist event is one where the world's cameras get focused on that event. And it's really done for a specific outcome. And this was really the first big spectacular terrorist event with that outcome in mind of having the United States leave Lebanon, which was essentially a breeding ground for what would come to be known as Hezbollah, what we know today as Hezbollah anyway. And it set this framework. It showed Iran and through its proxies that terrorism works. Because after the event, the administration talked tough, and we leave fairly quietly in early 1984. And we've really been playing by this set of rules that were set by Iran through its proxies in 1983. So that's why I wanted to focus on this event in particular as to kick off this targeted series, which explores different terrorist events and tries to capture the strategic, the operational, and the tactical lessons while also humanizing them. Because all too often we hear, especially in the days before social media and independent media, you hear that 241 U.S. servicemen lost their lives that day. And that's a big number. But it doesn't humanize those people. It doesn't humanize them and their families who have an empty seat at that dinner table still today. And when we're talking about strategic level decisions that impact families multi-generationally, of course, then what they owe the people they're sending overseas is to have an understanding of the conflict in which they're engaged or about to engage U.S. forces. And all too often we don't do that. We're not good at learning from the past and turning those lessons into wisdom going forward. So the least I could do is try to capture some of those lessons and then at the same time humanize this event. So for me, really, it's about getting out of the way of these stories and allow this to be, rightly so, the stories of those people who were there, the families who lost loved ones. So for me and my co-author, James Scott, amazing guy, military historian, Pulitzer Prize finalist, from the very beginning, when I first talked to him and asked him if he'd be interested in doing this with me, we talked about getting out of the way of this story and allowing it to be the voices of those who were there. So it's that's the reasons for starting in 1983, because it still looms large over our U.S. foreign policy today. And unfortunately, we haven't really learned the lessons of Beirut. We look at Afghanistan, August 2021, and we see something similar. We see U.S. servicemen, and in that case, women also, put in a tactically disadvantageous position, an untenable position by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. A bomb goes off in both cases. U.S. servicemen, and in the case of Afghanistan, women are killed, others wounded. In the case of Afghanistan, innocent civilians killed and wounded as well. But what gives me a little bit of hope, because both are dark days, is that the same thing happened. You had those who heard the bombs go off, run to the sound of the guns, run to the sound of that explosion, try to save as many of their brothers in arms and sisters in arms in the case of Afghanistan as well. They ran there and they tried to save as many as possible, and while holding security because they don't know if another bomb is coming. So that U.S. service member is still the same one. That still is that same person fighting for the person to their right and left. Same one who was in Beirut 1983 is the same one that was in Afghanistan 2021. Unfortunately, we have senior level leaders doing those same things, putting them in these untenable, tactically disadvantageous positions. So that part is tough. But the least I can do is at least get those lessons learned, capture them in a book for future generations.
Yeah. No kidding. Okay. Now, if you wouldn't mind, Jack, could you paint the picture a little bit? The war in Lebanon was 1977 to 1990. And maybe, to be quite honest, I'd love you to, as best you can, explain the dynamics. Why was there a war in Lebanon from 77 to 1990? Who were the key players? Israel was there. The U.S. was there. Why was the U.S. there? It's a good question to maybe begin with, and then we'll get into the bombing. I want to talk about that, and then the threads that have come out of it.
Yeah, the why is still even murky, even after having done 3 years of research into this. Of course, you have an area of the world that used to be the Paris of the Middle East. Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East. If you go back to the 60s and the 70s and look at pictures of, let's say, Iran and Afghanistan, there were some amazing pictures and people walking around in Western dress and Coca-Cola signs up, billboards, and you can go online and look at them, and they're amazing. And I remember friends of my parents showing me pictures of them backpacking through Europe in the 60s, and they took a trip over to Afghanistan to go to Kabul, and I distinctly remember that being just being enthralled by those stories. Like, wait, you went to Afghanistan? And at the time, I think I heard that story when I was 7, maybe 8. And it stuck with me. But people used to do that. You don't do that really anymore.
Not right now.
Yeah. I met a guy who took a motorcycle through the Middle East and went all the way to Tehran back in the early 70s. And he has pictures of it. He was showing me those. And so it was a different place back then. But then you have these factions that have, in some cases, centuries-old grievances, like the Sunni-Shia divide, which is something that they're still fighting over today. You have, of course, Christian sects there as well. You have Mennonites, you have Druze, you have Israel, like you said, that's coming and going, and it is devolving into complete chaos. Just a civil war. essentially. And what Iran did is then see this as fertile ground. It is closer to Israel than Iran. And they started putting people into the Bekaa Valley to train them up. And so essentially they planted the seeds of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is now the ruling party of Lebanon, and possibly going to be in a war with, you can just call it a war right now with Israel. But all those seeds were planted back then in that critical time period in the late 70s, leading up into the early 80s, into 1983 in particular, when now we get this model that Iran finds that works. So it's really about Iran using proxy forces, building them up back in the late 70s, early 80s, and then continuing to water those seeds and continuing then to spur the growth of this organization that is the ruling party of Lebanon. But Iran doesn't really care what happens in Lebanon. That's the part. They don't care how many people are killed or wounded or what life is like for the average person in Lebanon today, because they're being used by the regime in Iran to great effect. But it's still the same playbook. But the only reason it's a playbook is because we essentially fell right into this trap, where we showed them that terrorism works, that there's going to be no retaliation for this. And so they paid attention, and not just Iran, but other proxy groups and other terrorist organizations around the world. And so it's really become the model. If you want to influence U.S. foreign policy overseas, all you need to do is a spectacular event or wear them down over time through attrition.
Right.
And it works. So but it's a tough situation because it's such a mess, and it became such a mess back in those early days, and culminated for the U.S., of course, with October '83.
And would you say, Jack, that, I mean, you refer to it as a spectacular event, and I understand why you don't like using that term, but it does describe the events that we're referring to relatively well. And we're talking about the Beirut bombing on the barracks, the U.S. barracks in 1983. We're talking about 9/11. We're talking about the Hamas invasion of Israel. That's the spectacular event that we're speaking of. It's the asymmetric guerrilla style, somewhat spontaneous attack to a Goliath style opponent, right? That has outsized returns because it's hard to track. And when you're the David swinging at the Goliath, I mean, this is what earned Hezbollah a lot of, call it, street credibility in the Middle East, was it not? It was that they were swinging at opponents far larger than them with, and I understand a lot of the influence for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda came from Hezbollah's actions in Beirut, just showing a new playbook of how to attack an enemy that's far larger and more sophisticated than you, correct?
Oh yeah, most certainly. It became that model. It became that model, and not just this event, but then a series of assassinations and kidnappings in its wake, kind of reinforce what Iran was doing through proxies. So that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Hezbollah, before 9/11, they were the terrorist organization that is responsible for more American deaths than any other before 9/11, and this event was the reason for that.
Right. Okay. So coming out of that, the conflict wraps up sort of in 1990 with the Taifa agreement, the Taif agreement that was brokered by Saudi Arabia, brokering peace in Lebanon. And part of that agreement was that all militant groups had to disarm, with the exception of Hezbollah, which was allowed to retain their arms. And it's sort of unclear as to why they were granted this exemption, but they were allowed to stay armed in southern Lebanon. If I've got that wrong, please correct me. But how do you see that evolving into, if you were to write a story about that, Jack? Like, what did that conflict evolve into when you look at subsequent evolutions of conflict in the Middle East?
Yeah, so it's I believe that they were allowed to keep their arms because now it's a political party. It's a ruling party. It's not a organization. Obviously, they're building hospitals and roads and that sort of thing. So, which is kind of the evolution of these terrorist organizations, is that they try to become legitimate political parties, or at least have legitimate political wings that in many cases are elected. If you look at Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, we saw it in Iraq as well. That's why I was smiling when you said that, because I was involved in an operation in Iraq, a campaign in Iraq to retake the city of Najaf in the summer of 2004. And the way that ended up was about 2 weeks. We were involved with my sniper team for about 11 days of pitched street battles. But we got to the end, and the way that it ended was all of Jaish al-Mahdi militia into the Imam Ali Mosque, which is one of the holiest sites in all of Islam, in Old Town Najaf. And there was a peace accord deal, something done with the Iraqi government, and the Jaish al-Mahdi militia got to lay down their arms and be escorted out by some government forces, of course, to fight again another day. There's plenty of AKs to go around, so that's why I was smiling at that about laying down the arms, which really doesn't mean that much.
Could you walk my audience through your background on the ground in the Middle East, Jack?
Sure. I've been studying this just as a student since my earliest days, because I knew I was going to go into the military as long as I can remember. I found out about SEALs at age 7, so my sights were focused on becoming a SEAL ever since. So I went down to the library with my mom. She's a librarian, and we looked up special operations and what a frogman was, and found out about SEALs and that they were some of the most elite special operations forces in the world, and that the training was some of the toughest ever devised by a modern military. So I was in from a very early age, but as part of that, I'm also seeing the Time magazine and the Newsweek magazine covers that came across our kitchen table as a kid that highlighted Beirut. And when the bombing, of course, they both had the same cover shot when the bombing occurred. I distinctly remember that when that happened. But I remember watching the news with my parents, watching Walter Cronkite. I remember the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, so all those events were very impactful to me as a kid, especially knowing that I was going in the military. And even back then, I knew that my generation's fight was going to have some sort of a connection to terrorist organizations. It was very clear even back then from the nonfiction that I was reading, and then the fiction too. By 6th grade, I was reading the same kind of books that I read and write today, the same kind of books that my parents were reading. So I'm reading books by Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and David Morrell and A.J. Quinnell and J.C. Pollock and Mark Olden and Louis L'Amour. And then I'm reading the older books on my parents' shelves by Robert Ludlum and Jean Le Carré and Ian Fleming and Ken Follett. So I've always been a reader my entire life. So I feel like I was building up this foundation from my earliest days. But then in the military, my second deployment was I was 2 weeks into it when September 11th happened, and we all thought we were going to load planes right away and head right for Afghanistan. And it took a little bit. There was a little confusion about what our response would be, so it took a little bit of time. But eventually, we loaded up the C-17s, and I was in Guam at the time, and we headed for the Middle East. We still thought we were going into Afghanistan, and what we ended up doing was taking over shipboarding operations out of Kuwait to enforce the UN oil embargo against Iraq. So they would come out of Iraq, take a hard left for Iranian waters, and we only had a certain amount of time to get on board and turn them back into international waters. So that was kind of our job. And Team 3 that was doing that, they went into Afghanistan. But I did find myself in Afghanistan shortly thereafter, and then a couple of Iraq deployments. So I spent a little time on the ground in the Middle East, but primarily in Iraq. And as a leader and as an operator, you want to be able to make the best decisions possible under fire, which means understanding the enemy, understanding how they're adapting to you, putting yourself in their shoes so you can hopefully get inside their decision-making cycle, figure out how to capitalize on any momentum you may have, identify any gaps that they may have in their defenses. But really, it's about aggressive problem solving, aggressive creative problem solving, and trying to outthink your enemy, trying to think about how they would adapt to you so you in turn can outthink them. So I've been studying that area of the world for the longest time, but I'm always a student of what's going on over there. But it's even to someone who's been studying it their whole life, it's complicated. And to people that live there, talking to journalists on the ground in Israel and having them explain to me the relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah, the West Bank, Gaza, Iran, proxy forces, who has what, who has nukes, who would use them, what stage things are at, the political situation inside not just Israel, but inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, inside Lebanon, inside Iran, so inside the U.S. So there's so many factors at play when it comes to the Middle East. It's tough to wrap your head around it, but try to break it down and really tell this story in particular from the viewpoint of those on the ground, and then also from the senior level leadership levels in the Reagan White House. And that was really interesting to me because I've read things about Reagan, and he was my president growing up, the one during my formative years. And what I really took away from going into the archives and reading his journals and diaries and was what a big heart he had. He had such a big heart. And I think that was just how he was. But then he also had this thing, and this is the way how it impacts what happens in Beirut, is that I think as an actor he wanted people to like him. And that comes across in some of the writings. But as an actor on stage, you want to have that relationship with the audience. You want to know that they're enjoying your performance. You have this connection with them. So he didn't really like arguments amongst his cabinet. And you had different people vying for different positions. But if it turned into an argument, he didn't like that. He liked people to come to him with advice. And I think in this case, it might have been beneficial to hear some of these knockdown, drag out arguments when it comes to how to deal with Lebanon in particular. So, but really what came across is what a big heart he had. And I talked to Michael Reagan about it, and he said that what happened in Beirut haunted his father till the day he died.
Yeah, sorry. And Michael Reagan was his son?
Yeah.
Brother? Okay. Fascinating. When you say it might have benefited him to have heard some of these drawn out arguments about Lebanon, could you expand on that a little bit for me?
Just because you can challenge your own assumptions, bring in subject matter experts, people that you're surrounding yourself with at those levels have one job, and that's to give their best advice to the president without prejudice. And you have to be willing to hear that. You have to be willing to hear those arguments and to know that your top advisors might not agree. But you have to hear them out. And especially something like this, you might have to hear them out over and over again, until you come to the, whatever you think is the most, appropriate decision. And that's what you owe the people that are going down range, that are going to be deployed to Lebanon or wherever else you're going to send them around the world. But you definitely got the sense that was not something that he really liked to do those arguments. But you could have maybe kept Marines on ships with similar effect off the coast, possibly, or you could have just let the whole thing devolve into chaos and watch from the outside, because that's what's going to happen. I mean, hindsight's 20/20, of course.
Of course.
Look back through that, knowing that, and then try to put yourself in the shoes of those people making these decisions. But it's a tough place to put Marines, especially Marines that are trained up to go in and crush the enemy and then leave. And now you're telling them they're peacekeepers. And the administration used those terms over and over again, the peacekeeping terms. And even for me, I felt like I was fairly in tune with the different terrorist events, particularly in the Middle East. And I was aware, of course, of the April embassy bombing and then of the October Beirut headquarters bombing. But I wasn't aware of what happened between April and October. And I think that's because what happened there happened in the days before independent media, happened in the days before social media. And there isn't really the book that you can point to as like the seminal work on this event or that time period. And that was another reason that I wanted to write this book as well. If you'd asked me, hey, what should I read on Beirut 1983, or what should I read on the Beirut barracks bombing? There wasn't a book where I could have said, oh, you got to read this one. This is the one to read, or this is the documentary to watch. This is the movie to watch. Those don't exist. So that was another reason why I wanted to do this, to capture these lessons and tell this story that really hasn't been told up to this point. And in talking to these guys, you also get the sense that they felt not abandoned by the Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps certainly wanted to move on. This was not a day like raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This was a dark day for the Marine Corps, and they wanted to move on from it as quickly as possible. And those guys sense that. And to this day, that bothers quite a few of them.
Yeah, fair. Now, would it be fair to say, Jack, that the Beirut bombing really caught the administration flat-footed in that they were there perceivably on a peacekeeping mission? They couldn't have been expecting an attack like that, and the evidence is probably in the protocols. I understand the soldiers were not allowed to have bullets chambered. There was a handful of protocols that were in place to align with a peacekeeping mission as opposed to combat, part of which may have contributed to their inability to stop this attack when it began occurring. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and there's so much that I learned throughout the process of writing this book. I didn't realize that there was an entire car bomb defusing industry in Lebanon. There was one guy that was like the best at it, and the suicide car bomb, the suicide truck bomb, wasn't necessarily a thing that we did see it in April with the embassy bombing, and we're going to see it again in October. But really, throughout that whole time, there's car bombs going off. They just didn't have, for the most part, people in them. They were parked, but there was a whole industry that's around diffusing these things. So there were clues that something ominous was brewing. And of course, the embassy bombing on April 18th, was probably the biggest shot, the opening salvo, kind of like the jab. And then boom, we're going to get a couple more jabs, and then that cross is going to come in October. But there were enough signs, I think, looking back at it once again, hindsight being 2020, that pointing to the fact that things are disintegrating here, and regardless of what we do on the ground right now, things are going to deteriorate into chaos. So it's it's tough. It's certainly tough, but yeah, the signs were there, and looking at some of these letters, we had, I think, 1,000 pages of letters from people who were there, 600 from Dr. John Hudson, audio tapes that he'd sent home to his wife and son. Got to know his wife in the process of writing this book. So you got the sense from him in particular that he had almost a premonition that something was going to happen. Something was going to happen. It was only a matter of time. And then, unfortunately, on October 23rd, which is a Sunday morning, a time when most of the Marines there were, it was like a day of rest. It was a Sunday, and it was a little different than the other days of the week. So they slept in a little bit. And that was the day that the enemy chose to attack. And the stories that come out of it, though, this is what I mean by the humanizing effect, is that I was really trying to go for from the beginning. Is you hear about Randy Gatto, and he's walking across the patch of dirt, heading over to that barracks and headquarters building, and he stops and thinks, it's a Sunday, I'm supposed to go and develop this film in the basement, but instead I'm going to turn around and I'm going to go and grab a cup of coffee. So he goes into this other building, and that's when the bomb hits. He would have been right there, and certainly would not have survived had he continued on his original path. And then you have the chaplain Danny Wheeler, on the fourth deck, and he rides that thing down, and he is trapped in the rubble for 5 hours, and the only reason he survives is 2 concrete walls fall on each other and leaves a little bit of space for him to breathe, but he can't move. He's in complete darkness, and he's a chaplain, so he's having a conversation with God. He's having an argument with God, and he's thinking about the Louis L'Amour novels that he read, where there were cowboys and miners trapped in mines, having to search their way out and then fight. And so he thought about all those things. And you have Don Howell, a young Navy corpsman medic, who's in the basement, and the whole building comes down on top of him. And he hears screaming, can hear some voices, and he's in complete pitch blackness, doesn't know what happened. And he hears somebody's voice, and he says, "Hey, who are you?" And they say the name. Well, where were you? You weren't here when I went to sleep, type thing. I was on the 4th deck. And, where am I now? You're in the basement. And then he closes his eyes, says the Lord's Prayer, and sees a little shaft of light and starts clawing his way out and digs himself out. You have 2 dentists, Gil Bigelow and Jim Ware, who are there to do root canals and do teeth cleaning. and they end up running the rescue and recovery efforts in the aftermath of this event. You have Rabbi Arnie Resnikoff and another chaplain, and they're some of the first responders on scene. They're administering last rites, and they're pulling people from the rubble and trying to save as many lives as they can. So it's the whole thing is, it's a remarkable story as far as the rescue efforts go, because we look at this as a dark day, look at the deaths, but really in the wake of this explosion, there's a really heroic story of people stepping up and trying to save as many of their brothers in arms as they could.
If you had a grand takeaway, Jack, what would that be now that the project is complete?
Think long and hard before you commit U.S. forces anywhere in the world, but particularly in the Middle East, and take the lessons from history and apply them going forward as wisdom. There are a lot of lessons back there, and that's what the people under your command deserve, is for you to be a student of that history, so that you don't have to relearn those lessons in blood.
Do you think you referenced this at the beginning of the conversation, you have doubts those lessons have been learned and have been carried forward into today's activities?
Yep. Abbey Gates is a prime example. The withdrawal from Afghanistan is a prime example of that. And we're all too often, we don't study the lessons of history. We look at Afghanistan. We didn't have to go back to 3 British incursions. We didn't have to go back to Alexander the Great. We didn't have to go back to any of those times in the past. We could have gone to the Soviet experience from 79 to 89 and drawn lessons and applied them to Afghanistan in 2001, 2002. Yet if we did, we took the wrong lessons and applied them. So being a student of history, not just if you're an elected representative or a senior military leader, but really as a citizen. That's what we owe those people who came before us, who sacrificed so much, and the people who are coming next. Because really, when we walk into that voting booth, we're not changing anything for us, really. We're making decisions for the next generation. And to be able to make informed decisions based on history and a respect for the past and the future is something that we could benefit from, certainly as a country.
Why do you think that's the case? Why are hard lessons not carried forward in the U.S. military? You talk about all of the preparation that you'd have to undergo to understand the dynamics in Kuwait, and then in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq. I imagine intense studying, preparation, intelligence resources are all available, and so what's the lack? What's going on?
Yeah, well, it's even harder today because now we have these things we carry around in our pockets that are designed to keep us addicted, and not just us, but the next generation. So that's going to be even worse to keep our attention spans at about 15 seconds. And not just that, but manipulate thoughts and behaviors. And not only do they do that, but we're connected to them essentially 24/7. So really, they're manipulation devices. That is as far as they're a distraction, and that's something that that time spent on this phone and spent on these devices and spent arguing and spent being manipulated isn't spent in the pages of a book, isn't spent doing any deep thinking about history. It's a flash event and then distracted by the next one, another one, and then another one. We didn't, obviously it was a little different back in 2001, but we're still, even back then, before these phones were attached to us 24/7, we still weren't learning lessons. And we just have proven not to be very good at that. And I think part of it is not accepting failure, not wanting to talk about failure, not wanting to focus on that and wanting to move on from any failures rather than learn the lessons, especially in the political world, political field. If you were responsible for committing forces somewhere and it didn't work out, well, you want people to forget about that pretty soon. You want them to have that short attention span and be diverted by something over here. So I think that's a part of it. But for whatever reason, we just neglect to do that time and time again, is learn from these lessons of the past. But I think that's because we're really not a nation of readers anymore, unfortunately.
Even at a policy level. See, I totally resonates when I think about general civilians walking around. Yeah, staying distracted, off task, absolutely. Do you think that applies at a policy level as well when you think about the major lessons that should have been learned? Maybe you referenced, if you bury the lesson, the mistake, maybe you protect the reputation of the individuals or something there. But at a policy level, do you think that applies as well?
No, I think that there are different policy think tanks, obviously, that are now connected to this military-industrial complex, the intelligence complex, the ecosystem of that's essentially a business when it comes to our nation's defense and our intelligence services. But there are competing interests out there, and there are competing interests for funding, and there are a lot of reasons why you can make an argument any which way. And when you do find independent think tanks, or you look at one side or the other, they're certainly doing great academic work. They make mistakes. We're all flawed human beings, and when they're looking at something, they now have to be listened to. When you write a report, let's say the Rand Corporation, whatever, whoever writes this report, and let's say that the findings are appropriate and genuine to this problem set and should be listened to. There's so much noise out there, and there are so many reasons to do or not to do something that somewhere in that mix, there's somebody who, like in the book, there are people out there saying, why are the Marines there? They're going to be targets. They're going to be hit. This is going to end bloody. That's paraphrasing, but there are certainly people saying those things. Yet that doesn't impact policy. They're just someone saying those things. So it's really those correct findings have to make it up to that right person. And that right person in many of these cases is the president of the United States. And so that's one person at the top of this decision-making chain. And then at the bottom of that decision-making chain is going to be an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid holding a rifle off safe with their finger on the trigger. And
right.
That has remained the same. But the policy comes from one person at the top, and that person has to listen to the right people, surround themselves with the right people. And if there are competing points of view, that one person who is fallible, because we're all human, has to then make the right decision. But it comes down to study. That person needs to study. And that's tough. There's a lot going on. So I tend to fall onto the side that people are doing the best they can. It'd be horrible to go through life thinking the worst, and I'm sure the worst is at play, in certain cases. But when it comes to these big issues, I tend to think that the people at the top are doing the best they can with what they have, and they're fallible, and they're flawed, just like all of us. So they're going to make mistakes, and unfortunately, this was a big one.
Right. Okay. That's, it's a generous assumption to make, to be honest. I got to ask, what's your take, Jack, when you hear senators like Lindsey Graham or, potential President-elect Harris, doubling down on investment and involvement in, the two major foreign conflicts right now, both in Ukraine and in Palestine, Israel?
Yeah, it's once again going back to that history. We essentially put Ukraine in this position because of promises made during the Clinton administration. There's a direct line between what happened in the early 90s, promises made as the Soviet Union was going away and the Russian Federation was taking its place. And we can draw a direct line between things that happened there and really the direct result of decisions by the United States. So that's a tough one to say that everyone's doing the best they can, because that's one of the situations where I don't believe that to be the case. Essentially, that seems to be an avoidable war, and one that we almost went out of our way to essentially cause. So for whatever reason, it seems like lately we can't find a war we don't like. Is that because there's a whole industry out there that benefits from it in one way, shape, or form? Possibly. Is it inept leadership? Possibly. Is it not understanding the lessons of the past? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But certainly ones like that seem avoidable. Israel, that one, doesn't really seem avoidable. That's obviously one that's been brewing for quite some time. It's been in a kind of a steady state, and which is horrible to say because there seemed to have been for a number of years an acceptable amount of casualties that either side would take and wouldn't escalate things to the next level. And they found this kind of steady state for a long time. Of course, there are flashpoints here and there, but there seems to have been this acceptable level of violence that both sides could live with, as horrible as that sounds. And of course, October 7th, that disrupts that paradigm for whatever reason. So that one seemed like it was coming. Maybe it came a little sooner than Iran even wanted, but because of internal Israeli politics and maybe Iran not having as much control over Hamas as maybe we think they do. Of course, there are direct lines to Hezbollah. There are lines certainly to Hamas, but maybe not as direct as the ones to Hezbollah. But that one seems like it's been brewing, and that's been a powder keg for quite some time. But juxtapose that with Ukraine, that certainly seems avoidable if you understand the history.
Could I get you to, so I got a few threads I want to pull on there. Maybe I'll start with Israel and then we'll go back to Ukraine. You know, there was a similar conflict in Israel, was there not, in 2006, when Hezbollah, a much smaller scale invasion, captured a couple Israeli soldiers. This ended up spiraling into a full-scale 36-day war, but very devastating one for Lebanon. And Israel's response was sort of, the strategy was disproportionate response, right? If you poke the bear, we're going to attack full scale. And the outcome of that, as I understand it, is, Hezbollah gained admiration through the Middle East, and Israel gained international condemnation for their response. And I as I read about the 2006 event between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, there just seems to be so many parallels to Hamas, Israel today, in the way it's unraveling and being perceived globally. Would you agree with that, Jack? What are your thoughts?
Oh yeah. I mean, you have, of course, in the north, you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you have West Bank, and then you have Gaza. And when people talk about a two-state solution, I just don't. I think they're just repeating something they've heard too many times. It's certainly not a two-state solution. It's at the very least, it's a three-state solution. It's probably more like a 4 or 5 state solution if you really look at it. But you hear these talking points and you just repeat them over and over again for some reason. But once again, going back to history, what set up October 7th? And unfortunately, part of it was a deal that Israel made for an army hostage years ago, where they let out the people who then became the lead planners of October 7th. And so what did that teach the enemy? Similar to in Beirut, it taught them, hey, this hostage exchange thing works. We got, I forget exactly the exact number, let's say 1,000, but it was something like that, for this one person. Shalit is his name. And they traded that many people, and amongst those people were the planners of October 7th. So that taught Hamas and others in the region that, hey, this hostage taking works. Israel will make a deal that's far disproportionate as far as their level, their outcome, the benefit to them for this single soldier. So what are we going to do? Let's take hundreds of hostages. That's the next level. That's the next stage here. So it's mistakes are made. We all make mistakes, obviously, but in that case, and in the case that we're dealing with, that Israel's dealing with now with these hostages, there's a paradigm that's set up that's a tough one to break, because there's not a good end for those hostages. If you break the paradigm of those hostages being so valuable, you have to make the cost of taking a hostage so high that the enemy won't do it, and instead of giving them 1,000 foreign fighter, or essentially 1,000 terrorists for a single soldier. So it's a tough one, and there's a moral and ethical side to it, and there's a logical side to it. And I'm not sure that the moral and ethical side isn't the logical way to go if you're trying to break that paradigm. So it is definitely a tough thing that you're dealing with over there. And
What do you mean by that, Jack? The moral and ethical side might be the right way to go. Expand on that for me.
So if you do what's the hard ethical and moral choice now, and I'm just talking as far as I want to say that I am so glad that I'm not in this position to have to make.
Yes, sure.
So you essentially have to sacrifice those hostages now to change the paradigm. But if that's the logical thing to do, does that save how many more lives in the future? How many more events, hostage takings, does that prevent? So had they done that a decade ago, would we have had an October 7th? Because would there have been, would those hostages' value have been so high? So what you do for one soldier years ago that you think is the moral and ethical thing to do, does it lead to something even more horrendous? And is that the ethical or moral thing to do? Because now you have essentially caused or put the pieces in play that cause something even more horrendous. So it's so hard to grapple with.
Yes, right. Okay, that makes sense. Now, if you were to counsel whoever ends up in the White House post-election on a strategy in Ukraine, what would you share, Jack?
I feel like that you shouldn't have to do that. That you should just put in the history from the end of the Soviet Union up to today in front of them, and then you'll know the truth. Then really you'll know because it's a very clear answer that if you're going to put, it's like if Mexico was putting nuclear weapons or essentially ballistic missiles or whatever on our border, well, we wouldn't be too pleased about that. And essentially with talk of expanding NATO, including Ukraine and NATO, even if it's not going to happen, just the talk of it from senior level leaders, it goes back to putting yourself in your enemy's shoes. So I put yourself in a Russian's shoe, the Russian leader's shoes, especially if you know what promises were made to them back in the 90s. And now those are completely either forgotten about or not even discussed or just completely broken when it comes to talk of expanding NATO, even if it is just talk, and not having this buffer zone, which was something that was obviously and articulated as such, being essentially the one thing that was important to now Russia, is having this buffer zone between them and NATO and those countries of NATO. And yet we completely ignore that and think that there isn't going to be repercussions of a NATO expansion. And I mean, obvious what's going to happen. In fact, Peter Zihan, he's a geopolitical strategist. He predicted it back in, I think, 2014 in his book. What is it? The Accidental Superpower, right over there on the shelf. And he predicted it to the year. Almost to the day, essentially, of when this was going to happen. And he did it all those years earlier. And so the answers are out there, and it requires taking a breath and trying to understand your enemy, at least the best you can, in order to avoid war, and one that, in this case, could very well escalate into a nuclear confrontation, which is crazy to think that we're even talking about something like that in this day and age. Yet we are, and we keep poking that bear. It goes back to the understanding of history, and being able to make good decisions today that are based on those lessons from the past.
So how do you, if you were to try to understand, like you try to understand the mind of your enemy, if you're trying to understand the minds of American policymakers and NATO decision makers in this context, what was the intention and why? And why has Ukraine been the flashpoint that Crimea wasn't when it comes to American popular support and military action?
Yeah, well, we had at the time, we were engaged in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We had our wars.
Right.
And, so think of a company that's projecting profits, and all of a sudden those projections disappear over the course of a few years, and another opportunity pops up. What is the benefit of including new countries in NATO? Well, guess what? All of the ammo has to be compatible across those countries. Weapon systems have to be compatible across all those countries. That is big business. So there's certainly a financial benefit there, and one that's filling a hole for a company that has to show shareholders a growth per quarter. So I try not to be so cynical, but oftentimes it's difficult not to come to some of these conclusions if you just look at it logically.
That's fascinating and logical, and I get it. And reminds me of a quote from Peter Stuyvesant, I believe, who's the director of the Dutch East Indies Company, who said, "You need to understand there is no trade without protection from weapons, and there are no weapons without the proceeds from trade. And so we will never have trade without war, nor war without trade," which is essentially, we lost a big client in the Middle East war. We need to replace that client with somebody new. And so we've turned to Europe.
It's possible. It's certainly possible. And there was an opportunity really at the end of the Cold War, probably to really change our relationship with Russia. And now it seems like we're back in that same kind of conflict with somebody who has more nuclear weapons than we do, actually.
Right. Okay. I want to come back to Targeted Beirut and wrap up with this. So once again, Jack, why were you so called to write this book? Because to date, you've written a handful of fiction books. This is your first nonfiction. It's a big project. A couple of years invested into this. What was the motivation for you? Why did you feel like this book had to be written?
Yeah, one, it hadn't been written before, so there wasn't that one you could point to. It is such a turning point in our relationship with the Middle East, and it was before the time of social media and before independent media, so there really isn't that much out there about it, yet it was so important. And it's the model that Iran's been using ever since, that the rules established there are the same ones that we've been playing by ever since. So it really comes back to Beirut 1983 as a turning point for us as a country. And the shadow of what happened in October in particular still looms large for us when we're thinking about our relationship with the Middle East, particularly Iran via these proxies. I weave a lot of history into my thrillers as it is. I try to be a student of history. I talk about different historical events on my social media. So I got to this point where I thought I'd built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster to be able to pitch this nonfiction series idea. So when I got to that stage, I was ready to pitch it to them, and they loved the idea, and off I went to the races. So there'll be another one in the works right now, in the early stages of it right now. So that'll be about 2 years out, maybe a little longer, however long it takes to do the story justice. Because I want to make sure I wasn't just writing like popular fiction or popular nonfiction, meaning I wasn't taking a bunch of books that had already been written and just regurgitating them and giving my analysis of really other people's analysis. I wanted to go to those primary sources, wanted to go to the Reagan archives, the Marine Corps archives, wanted to read the diaries, journals of people over there, read the letters, listen to the tapes, look at the recently declassified documents about what was going on in the Reagan administration, and really try to paint a holistic picture and be very thoughtful about it. I wanted to be extremely thoughtful about it because you're telling the story of people who died. You're telling the story of people who dug their buddies out of the rubble, who are still essentially living back there on October 23rd, 1983, because it was such an impactful event. They're still living with the trauma of that day, the emotional and in some cases physical trauma of that day. And so I wanted to make sure that they were getting my very best, and that can take some time. So the next one, 2 years out for sure, maybe a little longer. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I was excited when I heard you say this was the first in a series. And for anybody who wants to pick up a copy, this comes out in literally a couple of days on September 24th. It is Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the war on terror. Jack, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much for taking the time. Great talking to you, and you take care.
All right.